Next up, we have Antisense Therapeutics. The ASX code is ANP. Antisense have a market cap of around 57 million. Antisense Therapeutics is a biotechnology company developing and commercialising antisense pharmaceuticals for large unmet markets in rare diseases. We welcome newly appointed Antisense CEO, Dr. James Garner. James, take it away.
Thanks so much, Manny. It's great to be here today and really a wonderful opportunity to introduce the company to investors. You can jump ahead to maybe a couple of slides, please. I'm going to jump straight in here, change of gear from the previous presentations. One more slide on, please. And I'm going to introduce the disease area that our company is focused on. As Manny mentioned at the top of the presentation, we're a biotech company. We're focused on developing new medicines, and in particular, we're focused on a disease area called Duchenne muscular dystrophy. And this is a genetic illness that affects almost exclusively boys. And so kids are born with it. And from about the age of 5 onwards, kids with Duchenne start to show weakness and difficulty moving. By the age of about 12, they're typically in a wheelchair. And sad to say, life expectancy is usually in the early to mid-20s. So this is a really horrific disease. What causes it? Well, these kids lack a protein called dystrophin in their muscles. They have a genetic abnormality in dystrophin, and it means that every time they move, their muscles damage each other. They kind of grate and tear against the fibers of the muscle. And that's what causes this cumulative damage that, as I say, leaves them wheelchair bound, typically in their teens, and unfortunately is profoundly life-shortening. So this is what we're trying to fix in our company. This is our target. If we can move on to the next slide, I'm going to talk a little bit, very, very high level, about how this disease is currently treated. And I don't want to drown everybody with a lot of science at this time on a Friday afternoon, but I think it's important just to understand that there are 2 main ways that we treat this illness. The top half of the slide here shows what we might call dystrophin restoration therapies. That is to say, drugs that attempt to replace this missing dystrophin protein in the muscles of these kids. Now, that approach works a little bit, but unfortunately, it becomes very, very sensitive to the individual genetic abnormalities in these kids. And so the drugs are very, very specific to just very small groups of patients. Even in those patients, sad to say, the results are not stellar. Although we can replace dystrophin a little bit, we can't do it as well as it's manufactured in a healthy patient. So the other mainstay of treatment is what you see on the lower part of the slide here, which is to give these kids anti-inflammatory therapies. If you're constantly damaging your muscles every time you move, then it follows that giving an anti-inflammatory drug is going to be helpful here at damping down that damage. And indeed, this is the main way that we treat the disease even today. Historically, we've used a class of drugs called steroids, which do work, but have a lot of toxicity. And so we're looking for new anti-inflammatory drugs. That's where we fit in. We're trying to develop an anti-inflammatory drug for Duchenne's disease. And this is really important. It sounds like a lot of technical detail, but what this means is that our drug potentially is applicable to just about every patient with this disease, not just 5 or 10 or 12%, but potentially almost all of the patients with Duchenne's can benefit from our drug. And secondly, it means that our drug potentially will combine really well with some of the other therapies in the class. So this isn't a case of a typical competitive landscape, which investors are used to seeing in so many industries, where the success of one product comes at the detriment of others. Here, the success of our product can actually enhance the success of others, and vice versa. And we think that creates a very, very healthy competitive dynamic for us. Next slide, please. Now, this is a really dense slide. I'm just going to pick out a couple of points here that I wanted to share with everybody today, because obviously the key question looking at a new drug for any disease is, well, what makes us think that it works? Well, we did a pilot study, what we call a phase 2A clinical trial a couple of years ago, and the results are summarized on this slide. And there's 2 things in particular I'm going to draw people's attention to. The first row of this study results table here describes a test called PUL 2.0, PUL 2.0. This is a test of power in the upper limb, how well these kids move their arms. And the reason we're looking at upper limbs here is because these are kids who are already wheelchair bound. So we look at the ability of the drug to keep the kids moving their upper limb safely. And you're all investors, you know that green means improvement in something and red means detriment in something. When we give people our drug 1102, we tend to see improvements in just about all of these parameters. And on the right hand there, you can see control groups, that's comparison groups. That's what we expect to happen if these boys are not treated. And there, in all these parameters, we see reduction in function and performance. So we're looking here at about a 2.9 point difference in this PUL 2.0 measure between the kids treated with our drug and the comparators. And we think that if that was replicated in a larger study, we'd be off to the races with FDA, which of course is our regulator in the United States. Now, that's not the only point here. I won't go through all these other points. I'll just pick out one other one, which is the MRI scans. Measures of power and function are a little bit subjective, and that goes for the territory in a disease like this. MRI scans are objective. They're very, very hard to influence. And even there, we see an increase in the lean muscle mass of these boys. So everything points to this drug being active. What we need to do now is replicate these results in a larger study. And if we go to the next slide, I won't go through all the detail here exhaustively, but that's exactly what we're doing. We've started what we call a phase 2B study. We started recruiting patients back in June, so that study is underway. It's running in 4 countries around the world. We're looking to get about 45 patients in the study. And we think that if we see the kinds of results we saw in the earlier study replicated in this larger, more robust study, we have a very, very viable commercial product on our hands. Next slide, please. And again, I won't bore everybody with a lot of regulatory affairs here, but let me just say that for any new drug at our stage in development, there's a lot of different ways this can get to patients. And you see here, we've sketched out some of the paths to potential FDA approval for this drug. The details of these don't matter much. What is really noteworthy, though, is that we are eligible for what FDA calls a pediatric priority review voucher. And essentially, if we get the drug approved, that's to say any scenario on the left of this slide that has a green box, then we should be able to receive a priority review voucher. Now, what is that? Well, it's a sort of ticket that allows any company to accelerate the FDA's review of any drug by about 6 months. So instead of it taking about 12 to 14 months for them to review, it'll take 6 months. We don't have to be the ones to use it. We can sell it, and they are a valuable product. As you can imagine, if somebody's got the next Ozempic or something like that, they want to get it to market as fast as possible. It's a multi-billion-dollar a year product, and so these things are valuable. And going rate in the market, 105 to 110 million US dollars. Next slide, please. Beyond that, what does this actually look like though, as a commercial market? We're not doing it just for the pediatric priority review voucher. Well, long story short, this is a very, very attractive commercial market for a company like ours. The products are already approved, are growing rapidly. They're doing very healthy sales. Price points are for so-called rare diseases like this are pretty high. And we're very confident there's a lot of patients out there who can benefit from treatment. So if we are able to get the product approved, we really have no doubt that this has very, very considerable commercial potential. Next slide, please. And maybe the next slide. I won't dwell on the competitive landscape here because, as I said earlier, many of these are not really competitors as so much as potential co-administered therapies. But I do want to talk just finally about where this can go for us. Now, the reality is we're a little 60-odd million ASX listed company here in Australia, we're not likely to be the ones that bring this drug to market in Japan, in China, even in the United States. So at some stage, we'll likely partner this drug to one or more larger companies. Now that might happen next month, next quarter, next year, who knows? But this is the likely outcome for our company. And I've put on this slide some benchmarks for what we think are comparable deals. As you can see here, some in Duchenne muscular dystrophy, some in loosely similar diseases, but different. And you get a sense of the numbers here. In particular, this top row here, NS Pharma's licensing of Capricor's drug, CAP1002. They received $30 million in the upfront, about 700 million in contingent milestones, undisclosed royalties on sales. That's a drug, that's just for the United States market. That's a drug that we think really doesn't have a lot of obvious advantages over ours. So we have high hopes and aspirations for eventual partnering of the drug. 2 slides ahead, please. And one more. And I'm just going to conclude here in the interest of time by saying that we have a lot going on in the company. Biotech companies are made and broken by news flow, and we've hit all our milestones so far this year. We've got a couple more coming up over the next few months. But our phase 2b study, the one that I mentioned earlier, the study that is really going to prove the worth of our drug, that study is going to read out in the middle of next year. So investors who are in Antisense or come into Antisense are really looking at about a 12-month horizon to find out what they're on. One of the complaints investors often have about companies like ours is they can move in geologic time. It can take a long time to get a result. This is not one of those companies. We're going to be seeing final data from our study next year. And that's a really exciting place to be in a biotech company. I've been thrilled to come on board and would be delighted to answer any questions.
James, thank you very, very much for that. It's a fascinating space that you're in. One of the, or a couple of the questions that have come through, obviously with with these trials, and in this particular case, it is sometimes tough to recruit candidates. You touched on it briefly, that you are in the process of that recruitment now. A couple of the questions that have come through are asking the question, how far along are you in the recruitment process? Have you enrolled? Have you hit 50% of the enrollment number yet for the population? Can you elaborate a little bit on that, and perhaps how you're going about getting those candidates as well?
Yeah, Manny, look, it's a great question, because we know that across the whole industry, about 80% of clinical trials recruit behind schedule, and that's in the hands of the really big companies, Pfizer, Sanofi, GSK, and so on, let alone companies our size. In that context, I'm really pleased to see right now our study is on track. Now, we haven't been rushing out numbers sort of on a weekly basis to say we're at 10 patients, we're at 15 patients, we're at 20 patients. Because the reality of studies like this is they recruit in a non-linear way. A lot of the recruitment is quite back-ended as hospitals open up at different times. So we're working out what's the right way to share that information with investors in a way that's helpful but illuminates rather than confuses. But I would say for today, we're on target. We're exactly where we expected to be at this point in the study. We've set ourselves a goal of fully recruiting the study by the end of the year. That is, it's ambitious, but it's feasible. And we're working with some really great hospitals, places like Great Ormond Street Hospital in London, the Royal Children's Hospital in Melbourne, as well as some really high volume centers in places like Turkey. And it's a really good mix of hospitals. And some of these centers have quite substantial caseloads of patients. So, and they're encouraged by the phase 2A data. They're really keen to see this study succeed. So I think we're doing everything we can. We're on track, and we're all watching it like absolute hawks.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you. Another question is around. So you recently completed a capital raising, and do we take it now that on the basis of that capital raising, you are now fully funded to get you through to the end of this trial, phase 2B?
That's right. We've got the study covered, which is a great place to be. We just raised, as you'll be aware, around about ballpark terms, $11.5 million and an oversubscribed placement to sophisticated institutional investors, and followed by a share purchase plan. So we're in the very, very fortunate position of having money in the bank. It takes us through the key parts of the study. So we're able to focus on the work now, which is very nice.
Okay, and just one last question. Obviously, the study is focused on DMD. Could there potentially be other applications for the drug beyond DMD, and what might they be?
Yeah, this is a really interesting question, actually. And if we had another 2 or 3 hours, it would be wonderful to go into some of the really, really promising exploratory data we've got here. But suffice to say for now, the drug, as I touched on, is an anti-inflammatory drug. So it has potential applicability in a lot of diseases that are driven by inflammation. The company already generated a few years back some really quite interesting data in multiple sclerosis, which of course an inflammatory disease of the brain. We've already got a little bit of data coming through ourselves in another form of muscular dystrophy called limb-girdle muscular dystrophy. And then in theory, there are a whole range of diseases from small esoteric inflammatory diseases right up to big ticket items like asthma, where a drug with this kind of action could be applicable. Right now, we're focusing really tightly on DMD. We think it just behooves us to try and do one thing well rather than to spread ourselves thin. But certainly there is a wealth of possibility beyond Duchenne's disease for this drug. And certainly I think that's part of the excitement here. This is a gateway indication, but it's not the ceiling of possibility for the drug. Okay,
great. And thank you for that. That's pretty well answered. So James, thank you again for your presentation, and do have a great weekend, and we'll move along.